Hey everyone, it's Mr. Pappas.
And Miss Berna.
So you are probably doing the floating chat experiment. You're going to start that. And part of it involves a little bit of science that we're going to explain to you right now. So in your experimental setup, you'll be using hydrogen peroxide and yeast. And we're going to show you what happens when hydrogen peroxide and yeast are mixed together and explain to you why the phenomenon that you will see actually happens. So here I have hydrogen peroxide, here I have a thing of yeast, and if I add them and stir them up with my finger, what is hard to see is that there's a bunch of bubbles being created and it's starting to rise. And we're going to explain where these bubbles come from and why it's rising.
Okay, so first, you should know that hydrogen peroxide is not a particularly stable chemical. When you buy hydrogen peroxide, you have to buy it fresh all the time. So if you have hydrogen peroxide sitting around in your medicine cabinet for more than a year or so, it's not hydrogen peroxide anymore. It's mostly water. We are going to show you a quick animation of what happens to a hydrogen peroxide molecule or hydrogen peroxide molecules as they sit around for a while. So you can see this is one hydrogen peroxide molecule. The red balls are oxygen and the white balls are hydrogen. So there's two oxygens and two hydrogens. When you have a bottle of hydrogen peroxide, there are tons of these molecules floating around together. Hydrogen peroxide is not a very stable chemical. As it sits in the bottle, the bonds between the hydrogens and the oxygens break. New bonds form after they break apart, and you end up with a different set of chemicals. So as hydrogen peroxide sits in the bottle, the bonds break and reform, and you end up with water and oxygen gas. So that's what happens when hydrogen peroxide is just by itself. The hydrogen peroxide turns into water and oxygen. When we add yeast to the hydrogen peroxide, the same thing happens. The hydrogen peroxide turns into water and oxygen. It's just that the yeast makes it go so much faster. Nothing happens to the yeast, it's just kind of speeding this reaction up.
So after watching the video and hearing the explanation, we want you to go through these questions and write your response to these questions, such as where does the water go?
And where does the gas go when it's created?
Is there any observable evidence of this happening?
So how do you know that this is actually what happened when we mix yeast and peroxide?
What does gas look like inside of a liquid?
And where have you seen gas in a liquid before?
What is in an air bubble?
And now I'd like you to imagine you're at a pool. What would happen if you put a deflated beach ball at the bottom of a swimming pool?
And what would happen if you took that same beach ball but you inflated it and then you put it underneath the pool? Then what would happen?
And that's it. Thanks.
Look at this thing.